Those who lived through better times left it written for us that in times of revolution the density of the class struggle makes days contain months and weeks contain years. Unfortunately, this physical law of class struggle also plays its role in times of general counter-revolution, when the concentration of contradictions that govern class society reaches the point where, without the concurrence of the revolutionary proletariat, the slightest detonation can activate a chain reaction that leads to an apocalyptic imperialist carnage, like that of World War III that looms today. We live on a volcano, inside of which there is a bottomless powder keg of nuclear warheads. Thus, the dizzying pace of the current decade, accelerated by the imperialist war in Ukraine, has been joined by the change of gear that the terrorist state of Israel has imposed on its colonial existence in Palestine. Since October 7th, the Zionists have murdered at least 14,000 Palestinians, not counting the 7,000 who lie in the rubble, and displaced 1.7 million, more than 3/4 of the population crammed into the Gaza Strip ghetto, under military siege since 2005. The ground invasion of this ghetto by the Israel Defense Forces, IDF, began on October 27th, after 20 days of bombing in which 18,000 tons of explosives were dropped on the heads of the Arabs. 3 weeks later, the IDF separated Gaza City from the rest of the Strip and, after taking its port, completed the operational siege of the capital, beginning, on November 17th, the general assault on the center of this city. To defeat a terrorist organization confined within 360 square kilometers, the Zionist state has mobilized 360,000 reservists and issued an emergency order to arm its citizens, out of which 120,000 pogromists who want to participate in the purge have stood out. Tel Aviv, consistent with its constitutive premises as a Jewish state, is undertaking an ethnic cleansing of industrial dimensions, in the style of the Nakba of 1948. The barbarity of the Palestinian catastrophe is a link that allows us to grasp the general structure of contemporary imperialism. The mere continuity between this crisis and its potential transformation into a great war on a regional scale, with unforeseeable consequences, accounts for this. On the other hand, after the end of the October cycle, the possibility of the return, the national liberation of Palestine, inseparable from the destruction of the Zionist state, inevitably involves reconstituting the universal elements of the general line of the World Proletarian Revolution, WPR, apprehending how its objective requirements are expressed in the specific conditions of the class struggle in which the proletarian vanguard of each country acts. Under such premises, we will approach the war of national resistance that the Palestinians are fighting, an anti-imperialist struggle that communists around the world must support. In the case of the proletariat of the Spanish state, this support is inseparable from the denunciation of the role that our ruling class plays in this massacre, of active military support for Israel, not only by sending a warship, frigate Mendez Nunez, that rides with the Yankee Sixth Fleet, but with the continued command over the imperialist troops that, under the UN flag, are part of the defense architecture of the Zionist regime on the so-called Blue Line. The Palestinian ghetto versus the Zionist Reich on October 7th, the Zionist state received an unprecedented setback when a guerrilla force carried out a massive incursion into its territory, surpassing its border defense at several points and advancing on populations that were left unprotected by the almighty IDF. This blow was a humiliation all along the line for Zionist terrorism, since the assailants came from no less than the Gaza ghetto itself. The humiliation was tactical, because the battle gave military victory to the militiamen over the overwhelmingly better-equipped regular Zionist troops. The humiliation was strategic, because the Palestinians demonstrated the limits of the Israeli counterinsurgency, the depth of the shortcomings of the security apparatus of the colonial power, which has not been able to nullify the resistance of the oppressed people. And, last but not least, the humiliation was ideological-cultural, because the racist mentality of the oppressor was turned upside down by human animals capable of making the people chosen by Yahweh, the British Empire and NATO to occupy the lands between the Jordan and the Mediterranean, bite the dust. The Hamas military command, together with other national resistance forces, deployed an authentic irregular combined arms operation on October 7th. The Palestinian order of battle established two echelons of combat, with the elite groups opening the gaps through which the bulk of the troops, essentially light infantry, then advanced. The breach and infiltration were covered by an initial artillery attack, thousands of rockets and various types of drones were launched within minutes, and an airborne force based on units with motorized paragliders was ready. This, not to mention the amphibious attempt along the coastline near the Strip. Analysts have different figures regarding the total force mobilized, which would involve several thousand Palestinians. Beyond the fluctuation of this figure, the concentration, sequence, complexity, and achievements of the attack suggest that the guerrilla command of this combined tactical force generated an operational level comparable to that of a regiment. We insist on the irregular nature of the Palestinian militia because clandestinely planning the Al-Aqsa flood from the Gaza ghetto and under the noses of the Mukhabarat, Mossad, and countless counterinsurgency organizations would have been impossible without meeting an objective requirement of the class struggle against a state actor, the ambushment among the masses. The overwhelming asymmetry between the forces in conflict requires the application of this principle of class struggle that mediates the continued action of any insurgent movement against a state, whether it is a petty bourgeois terrorist group, a national guerrilla movement, or the revolutionary proletariat. And we should not be surprised by the coincidence on this point. The reconstitution of Marxism as a vanguard theory requires underlining the character of the state as an objective social relation and as a political concentrate of the historical experience of the ruling classes that have succeeded one another in history, that have been passing on the loot of the state from hand to hand. This accumulated experience encompasses revolution and counter-revolution, chaos and order, the means that enable access to power, those that allow it to stabilize its dominance, and those that precipitate its loss. This universal experience is objective and is specifically codified in each bourgeois state. From this perspective, we can better understand, outside of all dualist and structuralist speculation, the Leninian characterization of the state as special bodies of armed men, as a political organizational body that is a product of class society at the same time that it represents a special moment of itself, which is a manifestation of the internal tearings suffered by the capitalist mode of production, social production, private appropriation, as well as the form of its false resolution. The capitalist state is the collective bourgeois that stands above the factions of the ruling class and the particular interests of the individual capitalist. This contradiction between the state and society can be defined as a contradiction between the state and the masses, since bourgeois society is the mass society. Thus, the masses state dialectic in its historical dimension is the material, objective, universal opening. That makes power vacuums a real political possibility and ambushment among the masses a practical necessity for any insurgent social force that seeks to confront a state military, either to expel it from a territory or to destroy it. Hamas has masterfully adapted to this general context provided by bourgeois society in its Palestinian form. In 2005, the IDF withdrew from the Strip, applying the dream of socialist Isaac Rabin, Nobel Peace Prize winner, "I would like Gaza to sink into the sea." In what this Zionist withdrawal had of the application of the reactionary two-state solution, Tel Aviv had the complicity of Fatah, which, for this very reason, was displaced in Gaza by the Islamist resistance. Israel's policy of containment from the borders allowed Hamas to fill the power vacuum to lead the anti-Zionist resistance and achieve ambushment among the mass density of the Strip. Truly, the Islamist Palestinian bourgeoisie has made a virtue of its necessity. From the forms of struggle imposed by the Zionist state, it has deduced the methods to apply its class program. October 7th was a demonstration of how these impositions have forced it to subvert the technological fetishism inherent to the bourgeoisie, sublimated in the colonial conditions of the Zionist Reich. The key to the successful subversion, albeit in a tactical operation, of the Hebrew state apparatus is in the capacity demonstrated by the vanguard of the national resistance to sustain the armed struggle against said state on a broad mass base. The level of planning displayed by the Al-Qassam Brigade Command in October, which dispels insurrectional daydreams about social revolution, is also instructive, a political military movement with decades of combat behind it, Hamas, settled in a hegemonic manner among a social base of oppressed masses, Gaza Strip, which has the organizational solidarity of other insurgent movements, Hezbollah, Yemen's Houthis, and the financial and logistical support of relevant regional state actors, Iran. Qatar dedicated about a year to the planning, design, and creation of the specific means for a tactical operation concentrated in a single day, and which had the objective to force the Zionist state to negotiate the exchange of prisoners. One must be very committed to spontaneous ignorance, a symptom of opportunistic senility, to neglect these lessons of the great class struggle and delegate all the complexity of the proletarian revolutionary process to the meantime, to the surrounding circumstances of politics, to the spontaneous development of the mass movement. Up to this point we have stopped on one aspect of the Palestinian national struggle as condensed in the action of October 7th, due to its illustrative nature for the understanding of the tasks that the vanguard of the proletariat must address in the construction of the revolutionary movement. But this determined form of the struggle does not determine, define, or allow us to understand the struggle as a whole, neither the one implemented by the Palestinian resistance against the terrorist state of Israel, nor the one that a proletarian party of a new type would implement. The Al-Aqsa flood became a true flood of the Palestinian masses on Zionist positions. It is not that the masses exceeded the expectations of their leaders. It is that they literally overflowed in an unstoppable and unappealable way the objectives of their vanguard. Despite the shocking organicity offered by the image of October 7th, the incorporation of the deep masses into the flood would have been the result of the rupture of the bureaucratic military colonial dam that held them in the ghetto. An unforeseen event that ended up crushing the Zionist defenses, healthily devastated the settlers, and altered the scope of a limited and autonomously programmed mission by the Hamas military command in Gaza, as declared by the political leaders of the movement from Qatar. As we have mentioned, and according to all observers, in its original form this operation would have had as its objective the arrest of some Hebrew invaders to exchange them for Palestinian prisoners. This was the narrow political route of that impressive work of military planning. The last speech of Nasrallah, head of Hezbollah, came to solidify this perspective of the flood as a limited tactical operation, destined for the realm of negotiation of the Islamist leaders in the Strip with Israel. October 7th would not be the meditated bugle call for a new intifada or for a general attack by the anti-Zionist axis of resistance. Of course, that does not prevent all the latter from ending up happening, because the swords are raised. It is not lost on anyone that the Hamas operation is resolved in the context of the Abraham Accords. The consolidation of this terrible alliance would be the seal of approval of the Regional Assembly of Israel and Saudi Arabia, a strategic complication for the Palestinians, but also for Tehran, Damascus, or Doha. In any case, the international and geopolitical dimension is intrinsic to the Palestinian national movement. It is part of its historical configuration and its class morphology, preceding the political hegemony of Islamism in the area. It is worth remembering that, after World War II, and in the course of the anti-colonial struggles in the Middle East, the Palestinian question was an expedient of the general cause of the Arab world. The Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, was originally an imported product, created ad hoc by the Arab states. The leading cadres of the Palestinian movement were trained in Arab nationalism of a socialist nature, among the same ideas that later circulated in Ba'athist Syria and Nasser's Egypt, promoters of the Great Arab Republic. While the revisionist parties had accepted post-war Soviet realpolitik, recognition of Israel, the nationalist left was shocked by the rising anti-imperialist revolutionary movement, Vietnam, and the enormity of the great proletarian cultural revolution. In this context, the left of the Palestinian vanguard split from the big house of Arab nationalism to look towards the proletariat, but without ever abandoning the national frontist logic and, consecutively, without breaking the Palestinian dependence on the surrounding Arab states. Of course, the result of the first Nakba also contributed to this vision. Hundreds of thousands, and later millions, of Palestinians lived as refugees in Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. State structures whose borders, as recent as they were fickle, responded to the withdrawal of the colonial powers and not to an Arab national self-determination that seemed to still be in progress. mystified under the common cause of the wars of the Arab states against the State of Israel, despite the Six-Day War debacle. At that time, the main base of the Palestinian vanguard, nationalist or leftist, was still outside the territories occupied by the Zionists since 1967, in the refugee camps east of the Jordan and in Lebanon, where the Palestinians had for years broad freedoms, which would be reduced over time, to fight against Zionism. By itself, this original superstate morphology of the Palestinian national movement would not represent a limit, quite the contrary. However, its baseline ideological premises, Arab nationalism, plus the conditions of the regional political context, the existence of Arab states united by anti-Zionism, as they had demonstrated on the battlefield, caused the vanguard to forego for decades the establishment of the main support base of the Palestinian Revolution. In Palestine, the most persuasive example of this political line is the hijacking of planes to put pressure on world and Arab public opinion by militants of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, main left-wing split from Arab Palestinian nationalism propaganda by deed, petty bourgeois terrorism as a tool for the exaltation of the mass movement outside the national territory. This does not take anything away from the anti-imperialist struggle of the Palestinian Fedayeen in Lebanon, Gaza, the West Bank or Free Jerusalem during that same period. Nor does it eliminate the attempts, in a Marxist tone, to place the gravitational center of national liberation among the exploited masses of the country, although such attempts, as we have noted, occurred in frontist terms, similar to those sponsored by the majority of the international communist movement, which concluded in its dissolution in a spontaneous mass movement, respecting the hegemony of the Palestinian bourgeoisie and its international institutionality, PLO, and, correlatively, trusting in the Arab state allies, whose dominant bourgeoisies were already fully integrated into the imperialist world system, despite their third-worldist drivel. The result of those attempts exposes the limits that the insurrectional spontaneist paradigm found in the multitude of trenches in which the revolutionaries fought during the October cycle. When the Palestinian masses spontaneously put themselves at the center of the board, First Intifada, 1987, the world around them had taken a 180-degree turn. Pan-Arabism, in its hues, was history. The Iranian Islamic Revolution stood as the example to follow to free oneself from the Western yoke, and Soviet social imperialism was concluding its collapse. On the ground, the proven incapacity of the anti-imperialist left and secular nationalism culminated in the political bankruptcy of Fatah, which since the Madrid-Oslo agreements became the capo of Zionism. In this historical context, Hamas emerges, the Palestinian node of the Muslim Brotherhood, an Islamist movement that has traditionally expressed the impulses of the regional bourgeoisie excluded from the domain of state power, as was the case in Egypt, Syria, Jordan, or Lebanon. In the heat of the First Intifada, Hamas bursts in, programmatically formulating the class interests of the petty bourgeoisie and its intermediate strata, sectors of the Palestinian bourgeoisie displaced from the markets of the international community who will be less willing to accept the fate, exile, and/or extermination that Zion has assigned to them. Hamas has learned powerful lessons from the history of the national struggle that, together with the genocidal pressure of Zionism and its NATO allies, have forced this bourgeois faction to blend in with the most exploited popular sectors, to rely on the oppressed masses to carry out its program, either destroy Israel, as they preached in the past, or to pressure Israel, as they have practiced for years. But this program remains dependent on external factors, a result of the precarious and contradictory position occupied by this faction of the Palestinian bourgeoisie at the national and international level. The role that the Arab House once played for the Palestinian national leaders is now played by the Islam House. Their contribution to the Palestinian cause, as long as it is led by the bourgeoisie, is indispensable. That is why the cause of Palestinian national emancipation cannot be independent as long as it is led by any stratum of the bourgeoisie, since it is a class dependent on the same imperialist system of international relations in which its main partners are integrated and whose reproduction they do not question. Without going any further, in 2012 Hamas applauded the demonstrations against Assad while the Arab League proposed a military intervention in Syria to impose peace and open humanitarian corridors, just like France and the US did to tear Libya apart. By supporting foreign interference, Hamas tore apart its anti-imperialist credentials in front of other peoples and disqualified itself as a movement capable of implementing national self-determination. The fact that there are resistant communists who have solidarity for Assad and Hamas and forget these details is another example of narrow empiricism and extensive forgetfulness, serious symptoms of opportunistic senility. But it must be emphasized that Hamas and the hegemonic role of its reactionary conception of the world among the Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, are not the origin, they are the corollary of an entire historical era. They are the consequence of the opportunistic sins of the labor movement, the burden of the unresolved files accumulated by the proletarian vanguard during the first cycle of the WPR. The Palestinian Islamic resistance is today at the vanguard of the fight against Zionist imperialism. Its class contradictions are those of a bourgeoisie without a state that faces a colonial war of extermination and that leads a war of national resistance wrapped in a serious dichotomy. Unrestricted support for the national masses or search for the greatest possible number of sponsors among the Islamic states. Given this situation, the trend that has historically predominated in the Palestinian bourgeoisie is conciliation, the recourse of the property-owning classes to the dispossessed masses as a means to reposition themselves, to resist and win in negotiations supported by the international community. But, beyond the objective contradictions that haunt its leaders, the fight against the national oppression of the Palestinian people has a mass, democratic and anti-imperialist aspect that reveals the contemporary character of the old Maoist adage. As colonialism experienced in the flesh on October 7th, imperialism is a paper tiger. Past and present of colonial oppression, we indicate that the action of October 7th is framed within the anti-Zionist pressure on the Abraham Accords, and that everything that underlies Palestinian national oppression is a privileged example of the political structure of the world capitalist system. Like any pact between cannibals, the imminent signing of the agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia, as the accumulation of imperialist forces, pivots on the reinforcement of the national oppression of the peoples. For the Palestinian resistance, given its mediate and immediate dependence on the ruling classes in the Arab and Islamic countries, the normalization of Israel among the international Islamic community, advanced by other minor minions of Yankee imperialism, in the case of the United Arab Emirates and Morocco, would be equivalent to its sacrifice on the altar of Yahweh. And here sacrifice is no metaphor, because the Zionist plan for the Palestinian people only admits two paths that end in the same extermination camp: quick genocide or slow genocide. The quick one has been applied in Gaza for more than a month and a half, truce included. The slow one would imply a turn of the screw, tightening the colonial regime. The quick one only needs Palestinians in corpse form. The slow one needs Fatah-type Arabs, willing to comply as sepoys under some kind of stateless police state, as Mahmoud Abbas's collaborationist authority in Cisjordan has been aptly characterized. Thinking about the stench of this victorious scenario makes Isaac Herzog salivate. We have to think about what will be the mechanism. There are many ideas that are thrown in the air, said the Israeli president, who is clear that we cannot leave a vacuum, that Gaza can no longer be a terrorist base. As the Zionist soldiery breaks through the walls and enters the Gazan buildings and tunnels, the High Command cannot stop looking north. There is speculation about a new major intervention in Lebanon. Nasrallah said that his movement did not participate in the action orchestrated by the Al-Qassam brigades, not that they would stand by and watch. The blows between Hezbollah and Israel have intensified in the latest weeks. Shared geopolitical interests. Without Hamas in the extreme south of Israel, the axis of resistance loses strategic depth and the IDF's energies are freed up for new ventures. A weakened Hezbollah in southern Lebanon would deepen the growing isolation of the Palestinian resistance in Gaza, the West Bank, and what may remain of Free Jerusalem. Iran, the regional power that is frontally opposed to the Yankee, Zionist, Saudi triad, would be left in the same position. The viability of the full package of Abraham's policy, as it relates to Palestine, is now being settled by military means. Its defenders and detractors cannot ignore this precipitate event that pushes the region to the precipice of a great war. As long as the pieces fit, for the U.S. the how is incidental. The important thing is that their regional transmission belts act as such and can contribute immediately to the struggle with China. It is true that a great regional war would entangle the increasingly embarrassing pivot to Asia, but this is what exists in the best of all possible worlds. There are multiple threads that entangle Palestine in world politics, which place it as a condition of the immediate course of inter-imperialist contradictions, of the struggle between regional powers, and of the national liberation struggle of the oppressed peoples. This is the immediate political negative of the history of class struggle in those lands, marked with blood and fire by colonialism in its classic form. If at the end of the 19th century the disturbed spiritual father of Zionism, the Hungarian Theodor Herzl, had stated that a Jewish state in Palestine would be the rampart of Europe against Asia. In 1920, one Winston Churchill, present in all the genocides perpetrated by British imperialism in the first half of the 20th century, wrote a panegyric, Zionism versus Bolshevism, a struggle for the soul of the Jewish people, in which he asked the good Jews for practical displays of patriotism and repudiation of Judeo-Bolshevik internationalist terrorism. He urged them to pack their belongings and leave Europe towards the promised land, to Palestine, where they would have the support of the Empire according to the Balfour Declaration of November 1917. No communist can forget this, the original construction of Israel as an instrument of the world bourgeoisie to combat proletarian internationalism, so nationalist weeds among the peoples and blocked the process of the WPR. Zionism is born and reproduces culturally and practically in symbiosis with colonialism. Ethnic cleansing, social nationalist communitarian articulation and militarism are the constitutive bases of the current Israeli regime. In our recent statement in solidarity with Palestine, we already said that the army, the Tzahal, is the true national party of Israel, the key mediation to understand contemporary Zionism as a movement and as a state. In 1948, Israel broke away from its imperial womb and acquired the class structure of an imperialist state under colonial conditions, that is, in an artificial way. If that structure is defined generically by the alliance between financial capital and the labor aristocracy, the most abstract aspect of the equation, financial capital, was, in the beginning of Israel, an international graft on the strain previously cultivated by the Ashkenazi socialist pioneers. The Zionist groups that emigrated to the Levant founded small cooperative-type sectarian communities, independent of the oppressed Arab peasant masses, whom they plundered and expelled from their lands, and a military support point for the British and French. The kibbutz-type social nationalist and petty bourgeois movement served as a mass platform for the plans of imperialism, providing it with growing special bodies of Zionists armed with a communitarian and racist ideology, ready to receive all military and financial aid from the imperial metropolises. As a product of colonialism, the historical configuration of the imperialist state of Israel, the formation of its backbone, expresses the political alliance between a series of imperialist powers and the Zionist labor aristocracy. The Tzahal, in origin, is the collusion of Anglo-American militarism with the Histadrut, a mass movement braided by bourgeois social relations of all kinds built around the associative communitarianism of the Zionist pioneers. The further development of Israeli society, which has received millions of Jewish immigrants in successive waves, and a true replacement and extermination of the local population, is elusive if this reactionary complicity is not taken into account. The subsequent neoliberal displacement of the country, similar to that of the imperialist societies of the Western Bloc, is the result of the class struggle over the decades, of the internal contradictions of a regime that is based, more than ever, on apartheid against non-Jews, 20% of the population. But the current correlation of forces, the decline of the Israeli labor aristocracy to the benefit of other bourgeois factions, has not altered either the basic class structure of the country or the essence of its international ties. Israel is a sovereign country that possesses nuclear weapons, whose interweaving with imperialism and colonialism makes it dependent on the great powers, mainly the United States. However, nothing is unilateral. Israel is dependent on the imperialist bloc led by Washington, yes. But the Zionist state is an irreplaceable piece for this bloc in particular and for imperialism as a whole. In the geopolitics of Western imperialism, the role that Israel plays as a line of defense of Yankee interests is evident. As an artificial graft on the Middle East, the Hebrew state is an advanced manifestation of the subjective and external action of imperialism on the peoples. It is the racist and criminal crystallization of how the bourgeoisie builds a world in its image and likeness, the crude demonstration of the masses, state dialectic, histadrut, sahal, by world imperialism. And for this reason, Israel is the international condensate of the historical leap of the bourgeoisie from progress to reaction, a step that long precedes the formation of the Zionist state. Because the state of Israel marks how the bourgeoisie has solved a typical, universal problem of the Enlightenment and the Democratic Revolution, it has solved the Jewish question with colonialism, racism, and fascist corporatism. For this reason, Israel is also a first-order cog in the articulation of the dominant imperialist discourse. The Holocaust industry as an ideology of victimhood is a petty alibi used by the Pharisees to dissociate themselves from their crimes. But it is, above all, a conception of the world that is fully functional to monopolistic capitalism and its tendency towards corporatism, manifestation, in imperialist terms, of that basic contradiction of capitalism, social production, individual appropriation. In gratitude for the colonial state that the Western imperialists granted them, exterminating the Palestinians, the Zionists reciprocated the gesture to their progenitors, opening the floodgates of victimhood as a political tool. And victimhood today conveys the way of thinking and the way of acting of all factions and dominant currents throughout the planet. A true epitaph for bourgeois society, here lies a victim of itself. Although we communists work so that in the grave of barbarism it can be read, here lie the enemies of the revolution. Palestine and the reconstitution of proletarian internationalism. Palestine, core of the world, can be read on an old poster of the resistance. And that slogan is dialectically recognizable from a materialist position if we start from a communist principle. The constitution of the proletariat as an independent party strips the national liberation movements of their apparent autonomy, their independence of the great social revolution, Marx, and subordinates them to the proletarian revolution. For that matter, the Palestinian will not be free as long as the worker remains a slave. Ending the catastrophe is not possible without the communist return, because the national oppression of Palestine takes the form of colonial oppression by an imperialist metropolis planted on its territory, which suffocates it with all types of extra-economic coercive means, expropriation of land, of housing and all national resources, destruction of industry and agriculture, commercial, fiscal and financial intervention and control, permit system for Palestinian workers in Zionist territory, within a plan of national extermination. For this reason, national self-determination and the destruction of the State of Israel are two directly intertwined aspects of Palestinian liberation. From its historical formation, the constitutive elements of the political morphology of the Palestinian national movement are conditioned by its bourgeois class character. The contradictions of the parties and factions that have been occupying the vanguard role of this movement are the subjective record of that place that the Palestinian bourgeoisie occupies in the world, a property-owning, capitalist class, but without a state, doomed to colonial extermination, and that subsists in dependence on a series of international allies that cannot break the oppressive imperialist chain to which they belong. The practical trajectory of the Palestinian national movement demonstrates that the democratic character of the pending revolution can only be resolved as a revolution of a new type led by the proletariat. The destruction of the bourgeois state demands the application of the proletarian solution to the contradiction between the state and the masses, the subsumption of the former into the latter, the substitution by violence of the bourgeois state machine by the people in arms, and its articulation as a support base for a unitary, democratic, and international republic for all of Palestine. This program, as a form of the dictatorship of the proletariat in the conditions of this oppressed country constrained and crushed by a colonial political military structure, can only be carried out through the transformation of the war of national resistance into a people's war, this process being an organic part of an internationalist revolutionary movement that stabilizes in the Zionist regard a mass platform for the military struggle against that bourgeois state. It will matter little if on the other side of the green line the proletarians who make up this internationalist movement have an Ashkenazi, Druze, Muslim, Ethiopian, Sephardic, Christian, etc. ancestral origin. But neither the People's War nor proletarian internationalism are directly deduced from the immediate objective context analyzed up to this point. It is not a matter of consequently stretching the war of resistance nor of observing a false political instinct of solidarity between the sections of an international class whose material reproduction takes place in national compartments, as the class struggle in the Levant tragically emits. It is a matter of elevating the proletariat to the position of vanguard fighter for democracy, a matter of the reconstitution of the Communist Party in Palestine as an objective prerequisite for the transformation and revolutionization of society through people's war. Therefore, our duties towards the Palestinian Revolution are to reinforce proletarian internationalism, to contribute to the rise of the revolutionary left in Palestine from the river to the sea. The end of the October cycle has left a bleak world panorama, which the proletariat is incapable of influencing independently. The intensity of this devastation increases to unspeakable limits in mortified Palestine, where a people is mercilessly torn to pieces by a colonial power. There, the anti-imperialist resistance is hegemonized by the nationalist and Islamist component of the bourgeoisie, while the vanguard of the proletariat is dominated by militarist and frontist reformism, an understandable correlation in a context of permanent colonial siege and annihilation, of a war of resistance against national extermination and within the framework of general retreat of the WPR. There's no more than to recognize this objective situation of the vanguard to the merits of the Palestinian workers and peasants. Their dignity in the anti-imperialist combat is an example for the revolutionary communists. For its part, in Israel the working class is rotten with Zionism, although there is a minority section that resists collaborating with the extermination and participating in the colonial war. This section of the working class does not defend a revolutionary line, but rather raises the white flag of social pacifism, exercising an opposition, non-proletarian, non-Marxist, non-internationalist, that does not fail to retain a certain decorum in a militarized bourgeois state, whose national party is the army, where fascist pogroms are promoted by the authorities and censorship, imprisonment or murder are the fate of the dissidents that questions the racist basis of the regime and its criminal war. And where the very history of the labor movement is littered by the influence, under different hues, of Zionism. An immediate decorum, to hinder the war machinery of one's own government, and immediate decorum, because it indicates that even in the belly of the beast there is an objective social basis for, from two-line struggle and the erection of an internationalist reference, implementing a unitary policy among peoples in the common anti-Zionist struggle. Of course, the conditions of both peoples or their vanguard cannot be compared. The Palestinians are the oppressed and all forms of their struggle are legitimate and necessary. The working class of Israel is complicit in the oppression, its hands are stained with the blood of the slave and it will only be able to wash it off with the blood of the slaver. Only by taking the initiative and fulfilling the requirements of that internationalist mission, the destruction of the Zionist state, can it redeem itself from its social chauvinist sins and win the trust of its equals. But we must insist on the general scenario in which the vanguard of the two countries developed to show that, from their particular and immediate material presuppositions, the nationalist spiral encouraged by the reactionary classes and imperialism can only beget the same bourgeois consciousness that hinders social and national emancipation. In the midst of the nationalist maelstrom, foreign voices and external references can take on a powerful quality as a guiding rope for those sections of the international vanguard immersed in the most terrible forms of barbarism. What do these foreign and external voices say to the Palestinian and Israeli vanguard? By force, the traditional position on the Palestinian question among the revisionists of the Spanish state is losing steam. However, there are still nostalgic voices echoing the two-state solution. In the PCTE they can be satisfied, because President Sanchez, whose first great act of legislature was to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, is already working to recognize Palestine as a state. This presidential promise, in the midst of the genocidal escalation of his Zionist allies and in which his government participates, does nothing to help the freedom of the Palestinians, but it honors the words once spoken by a GAL minister. In Spain they do funerals well. The PCTE, a practical party if there ever was one, will attend the ceremony with some plastic flowers. At its side, Frente Obrero adds nuance, reconstruction of the 1967 borders, rejection of Zionist terrorism and, the nuance, denunciation of Palestinian Islamism, to evoke the time when the left led the resistance. Social fascism cannot hide its opportunistic senility, because the 1967 borders not only propped up the State of Israel, not only did they involve the recognition of Zionist terrorism, but the insistence on this reformist program by the Arab left was one of the main factors that levered the Islamists to the leadership of the Palestinian resistance. Furthermore, these Islamists, and their bourgeois pragmatism, Hamas, already accepted in 2008 and ratified in 2017 the same solution that the Crusaders of Frente Obrero embraced together with Sanchez and Mohammed VI, the colonial imperialist farce of the two states. From this revisionist chorus come other voices that seek to distance themselves from the two-state solution. One of them is that of the PCOE that, after its note published on November 15th, could hang the sign of liquidation due to closure and absolutely nothing would happen. According to what they themselves responded to the question of what can the international working class do about the situation in Palestine. In their vivacity they answered that only the organization of the working class will put an end to the fascist genocide and the capitalist system. According to the PCOE, the trade unions show us the way to go. They were not referring to the General Secretary of UGT, criminal office from the proletarian point of view, without the need to add anything else, who left his purple scarf at home to go cry at the Israeli embassy for the victims of Hamas. The PCOE expressly points at the dockworkers of Barcelona, who at the beginning of November decided not to work with ships likely to transport weapons, emphasizing, the port workers themselves, that this does not imply any political position and that they base this measure on a strict rejection of any form of violence. The just practical decision of the Barcelonian dockworkers hinders the logistics of imperialist militarism. The voice of the PCOE hinders the PCOE. Sometimes it is better to remain silent and appear to be a liquidationist at the rearguard of the labor movement than to open one's mouth and confirm it, because if the workers and their apolitical and pacifist unions are the ones who show the path to follow for the communists in supporting Palestine, why would the workers, the communists and the Palestinians need the PCOE? For absolutely nothing at all, luckily for each and every one of those questioned. And yet, through a falsified question and an economist answer, the PCOE has touched upon some truth, because it has portrayed the place that revisionist detachments like their own occupy in the world, representatives of a senile class, incapable of understanding aspects elementals of Marxism-Leninism and class struggle, lacking any political perspective and whose organizational life lies in parasitizing workers, communists, and oppressed peoples. The two-state policy is not a practical solution to the Palestinian question unless the slow path to genocide is sought, as the 30 years that have passed since Madrid-Oslo attest. The pragmatic voice of false communism includes other hues of economism, but they all agree in dictating to the Palestinians that the revolution is implausible, that an internationalist policy with the Israeli proletariat is impossible, which is equivalent, whether one likes it or not, to denying the revolutionary destruction of the Zionist state and keeping the Palestinians dependent on their bourgeoisie, subjected to the imperialist chains. This is the solidarity projection of the place that the labor aristocracy occupies in society, the trade union as a platform for all labor politics, class dependence on financial capital and search for its own plot under the monopolistic bourgeois state. False communism denies the possibility of internationalist and democratic coexistence between peoples. They have accepted that we live in the best of all possible worlds, and like good renegades they strive to reproduce it in all its elements. Regarding the vanguard in Palestine and Israel, the revisionists of the Spanish state contribute to the hostility, to maintaining distrust between peoples and promoting reformism and nationalism. The revisionists are at the tail of imperialism and its long-standing policy for Palestine. Let's not forget, the British bourgeoisie, seasoned in the art of imperial crime in Ireland, India, etc., cultivated discord between neighbors in the Levant with the declared objective of fighting against the internationalist vanguard and blocking the WPR. The revisionists keep Churchill and the Empire. We keep Stalin and the Comintern. The Georgian said, in his synthesis of the general line of Marxism on the national question, that in times of counter-revolution, the stronger the nationalist wave, the louder the voice of proletarian internationalism must be raised. The Comintern gave the seal of approval to this idea as universal and put it into practice in its articulation as a world movement for the elevation of the class to communism. The Communist Party of Palestine was established in 1923 on the basis of the unity and indivisibility of the proletarian class struggle, with the aim of promoting the fusion of Jews and Arabs into a single revolutionary movement. The Comintern, brought together by the revolutionary praxis of the Bolshevik Party and the Soviet proletariat, provided an internationalist horizon to the vanguard of Palestine. This is the actual way forward for communists, the only one that is truly practical and supportive of the revolutionary interests of the oppressed classes. In our statement from October, and in the present one, we have pointed out the elements of the general line of the WPR in relation to Palestine. With this we are much more concrete and precise than all the pragmatists put together, since we place the internationalist solidarity of the proletariat in the field of real and effective action of the communist vanguard, in this general period of impasse and reactivation of the WPR. We are not the ones who build metaphysical castles in the air, nor the ones who seclude themselves in the ivory tower of reformist activism, nor the ones who surrender the peoples crushed by imperialism to the UN brothel. We, the revolutionary communists, exercise workers' solidarity with the Palestinian national movement by projecting internationally, from our specific conditions, the universal dialectic that must preside over the second cycle of the WPR, the Vanguard Party dialectic. Because this solidarity must be an organic part of the struggle for the ideological and political independence of the proletariat, a material objective stepping stone for the advancement and reconstitution of proletarian internationalism. Authentic communist solidarity, its revolutionary quality, involves developing the fight against the social chauvinist and opportunist currents that rot the ICM and creating a vanguard movement that continues to deepen the summation of the October cycle. We recognize that, in the terrible conditions of the class struggle in Palestine, our foreign and external voice cannot have immediate reach or direct impact for the revolutionary transformation of the situation. But this is the only horizon, the only realistic alternative, that can provide a guideline that lead the revolutionaries of those latitudes, necessarily trapped in the turbine of anti-colonial resistance, in the articulation of an incipient vanguard movement that undertakes the reconstitution of the Communist Party as a requirement to transform the resistance into a people's war. Here the only utopia, and a reactionary one, is to think that Palestinian liberation can be resolved at the hands of the Arab and Islamic bourgeoisie and without the help of the masses crushed by Zionism within the borders of the State of Israel. Even from the constrained framework of national freedom, it is reckless to do without internationalism. Is there any other class, party, or fraction that is going to carry out this revolutionary transformation in a practical, direct, and immediate way? Step forward. Meanwhile, and against the immense wave of nationalism and revisionism, revolutionary communists will continue to raise with all our strength the voice of proletarian internationalism. Committee for Reconstitution, Spanish State, November 25, 2023.